24 December 1944. Schnee Eifel, ridge east of St. Vith, near midnight. The forest breathes frost into the lungs, and the spruce needles glitter like bayonets under a thin moon. In dugouts crusted with rime, sentries of the 18. Folk's Grenadier Division warm their hands over a tin stove, while a field radio murmurs a carol from Cologne. Then the wind carries in a second sound. Low, layered, mechanical. A distant knitting of engines that does not belong to any farm truck or staff car. A corporal steps into the open, breath smoking, and hears it build until it seems to skim the treetops. When he looks up, pale discs peel across the clouds and bloom into round, ghostly flowers. Silk, shoots, falling where no enemy should be, deep behind the German spearheads thrusting toward Bastogne. For weeks, the ranks have whispered of Americans in stolen uniforms, of false papers and sabotage, Skorzeni's commandos. The watchword of Wacht am Rhein turned into a riddle at every checkpoint. Now the rumor takes shape in the sky. A flare hisses. Rifles answer. Bolts rasp with gloved hands gone slick with ice. A grenadier later writes that his heart beat against the stock. Certain the Allies had dropped paratroopers on their backs. But the first canvas to thud into a snowfield carries no man, only crates lashed beneath a G-type parachute, tins and bandages clinking, a bundle blown far off course from the American resupply streams that had resumed once the clouds broke. Confusion multiplies faster than orders can travel, sentries firing at silk and shadow while the drone drifts onward toward Bastogne. What begins here on a still Christmas night is not a single landing but a chain of misread signs and scattered descents that will turn the quiet rear into a battlefield of rumor and reality, and lead us to the first of the drops that made it so. December 1944, the Eike western horizon of the Reich burned gray under low cloud and defeat. Yet, in the concrete warrens beneath the Führerhauptquartier Adlerhorst, Adolf Hitler clung to one final vision of reversal. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, was to be his grand counterstroke, a lightning thrust through the snow-choked Ardennes that would split the Allied front, capture Antwerp, and trap 4 entire armies in a single hammer blow. The plan demanded secrecy, bordering on the impossible. Panzer divisions were redeployed by night, their markings painted over. Orders traveled by courier rather than radio, and entire units were warned that discovery meant the ruin of the Reich itself. When the offensive opened on 16th of December, the hills of the Eifel trembled under the roar of more than 1,000 guns. Kampfgruppen led by Piper, Kokott, and Manteuffel surged forward beneath a ceiling of fog so thick that Allied aircraft lay grounded, an unearthly silence above their advance. But the very landscape that concealed them betrayed them in time. The Ardennes, once chosen as a route of surprise, became a maze of frozen switchbacks where trucks and horse-drawn carts tangled nose to tail. Bridges collapsed under the weight of King Tigers, and columns waited hours for fuel that never arrived. Piper's spearhead burned precious gasoline simply idling in the valleys, while quartermasters bartered for captured American jerry cans. By the week's end, the German schedule, to reach the Meuse by the 3rd day and Antwerp within a week, had dissolved in drifts and traffic jams. Across the lines, Eisenhower's headquarters pieced together the scope of the attack, and counter-orders rippled outward. The 101st Airborne dug in around Bastogne. The 82nd Airborne held the northern corridor. British armor readied along the Meuse. Both Allied and Axis commands began watching the sky again, knowing that when the fog lifted, paratroopers would fall once more. By the closing months of 1944, the Allied airborne arm had evolved from an experiment into a precision instrument of war. The U.S. Army Air Forces, guided by the lessons of Sicily, Normandy, and Holland, had turned the once chaotic art of mass airdrop into an industrialized system of transport, timing, and navigation. At its heart was the C-47 Skytrain, the twin-engined workhorse built by Douglas, capable of lifting 28 fully equipped paratroopers, or roughly 3,000 pounds of cargo. Fleets of these aircraft, painted in alternating black and white invasion stripes, now spanned airfields across England and France. Each carried the new Rebecca Eureka radar beacon link, a system that allowed pathfinders on the ground to transmit a pulsing signal to approaching squadrons, guiding them to their precise drop zones even through fog and darkness. The green glow of an Aldous lamp or the red wink of a panel flare was often the last earthly sign the Jumpmaster saw before he shouted the order that sent men tumbling into the wind. Supporting the sky trains were ranks of CG-4A, Waco gliders, canvas and plywood craft that could haul jeeps, 57mm anti-tank guns, or supply pallets straight into forest clearings and fields no wider than a village square. What had begun in 1942 as risky improvisation had, by December 1944, become doctrine. Under the 1st Allied Airborne Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Louis H. Brereton, entire divisions could be launched within hours to reinforce a threatened sector or seal a breakthrough, their reach extending 500 miles from bases stretching from Grantham to Reims. For German headquarters, officers counting their dwindling fuel reserves and scanning skies already owned by Allied air superiority, these figures translated into dread. They had seen how the airborne machine could paralyze communications, isolate regiments, and turn the rear into a battlefield overnight. So when teletypes at 6th Panzer Army headquarters near Zülpich crackled with reports of parachutes over the Eifel on the night of December 24th, no one paused to question. The memory of Sainte-Mère-Église and Nijmegen lived in every mind, and panic was the only logical response. The night of 24th of December 1944 fell hard and wind lashed over the Schnee Eifel. The moon was veiled behind drifting cloud, the air sharp enough to crack skin, and the forests groaned beneath the weight of snow. At Châteaudun and Étain airfields in France, engines of the 315th Troop Carrier Group coughed to life in the darkness. Their mission was no grand airborne invasion, only a lifeline. Within the C-47 Sky trains rode fragments of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Liaison Detachments, Pathfinder crews, and a scattering of OSS operatives. Their task was to drop emergency supplies and re-establish radio beacons for Patton's Third Army, now clawing northward from Arlon to relieve the Bastogne pocket. For the men inside those planes, it was meant to be a brief surgical strike. At 22:30 hours, the formation lifted into the gale, navigating by dim beacons and gut instinct. Over the Ardennes, the storm worsened. Wind speeds spiked above 30 knots, and sleet smeared the cockpit windows. Pilots lost sight of one another almost at once. Instead of descending over friendly drop zones near the Allied line, several aircraft drifted east, deep into enemy territory. Silk blossoms opened across the night sky above Prüm, Gerolstein, and the high ridges near Blyalf, 20 miles beyond where any American was supposed to be. On the ground, the reaction was electric. Volksgrenadiers and Feldgendarmerie units believed a major airborne assault was underway. Villages locked down, roadblocks sprouted overnight, and patrols fired at shadows. Hitler Youth Auxiliaries were ordered to guard bridges. Rumor spread that American commandos in German uniforms had landed to sabotage fuel depots. In truth, fewer than 150 men had jumped, many scattered, injured, or without radios. Yet their accidental incursion froze entire supply corridors for 2 days as the 6th Panzer Army braced for an attack that never came. Thus was born the legend of the Weihnachtsspringer, the Christmas Paratroopers, a ghost army conjured by weather, courage, and fear. By dawn on 25 December 1944, the German command's maps of the Ardennes were bleeding with phantom symbols, tiny parachutes inked between Bitburg and Malmedy, everyone representing a rumor. Reports poured into the 6th Panzer Army and Oberkommando der Wehrmacht headquarters claiming hundreds of enemy parachutists were on the loose. The 62nd Volksgrenadier Division wired that it had sighted strong airborne concentrations near the Kyle River. Patrols swore they had captured infiltrators in American uniforms. Even the Luftwaffe's night fighter units, watching radar echoes from the Eifel Hills, believed they were tracking waves of Allied transport aircraft. By noon, Radio Berlin carried an official warning. Enemy commandos disguised in American uniforms have descended behind our lines. The broadcast echoed the paranoia left by Otto Skorzeni's Operation Greif, launched just days earlier in which German troops had stolen U.S. jeeps and uniforms to sabotage bridges and misdirect traffic. Now those stories fused in the German imagination. The enemy, it seemed, not only drove their vehicles but had begun to fall from the heavens themselves. Orders from OKW demanded that every roadblock verify identity through passwords and papers. Anyone failing to answer correctly was to be detained or worse. The reaction jammed the arteries of an already faltering offensive. Fuel convoys halted at checkpoints waiting for clearance that never came. Medical trucks froze on back roads while wounded men lay untended in frontline aid stations. A Luftwaffe colonel later wrote that the roads were filled not with tanks but with suspicion. Captured American airmen, interrogated days later, recalled German officers ranting about the Christmas drop that stabbed the heart of the fatherland. In truth, fewer than 150 paratroopers had fallen, but their unintended raid achieved what tons of ordnance could not. It convinced the Reich's last offensive that ghosts haunted its skies, opening the path for Patton's counterstroke from the south. By the winter of 1944, every parachute drifting down over Europe was the final act of an enormous industrial choreography. The airborne arm of the United States did not spring from daring alone. It was sustained by a logistical empire that stretched from Pennsylvania mills to English airstrips. In less than 3 years, American industry had produced more than 10,000 C-47 Skytrains and over 1.5 million parachutes woven from silk and the newly developed nylon that replaced it when Asian imports were cut off. The Quartermaster Corps' depot in Philadelphia served as the nerve center, coordinating more than 300 subcontractors to turn bolts of fabric into harnesses, static lines, and reserve chutes. Every piece was tested, stamped, and color-coded, red for ammunition, yellow for medical, blue for rations, before being crated for shipment across the Atlantic. Equipping a single paratrooper required staggering tonnage. Roughly 2.3 tons of material when one counted the folding M1A1 carbine, the T5 harness rig, rations, radios, and spare silk. When multiplied by thousands of men, the sky itself became a supply artery. During the height of the Battle of the Bulge, the Allied Air Transport Command moved more than 11,000 tons of fuel, food, and ammunition each day into Belgium. An aerial lifeline sustained by factories that never slept and air crews who flew until their engines froze solid. This capacity made the Christmas Eve missions possible. Even when a few hundred parachutes went astray, they were absorbed by an industrial base so vast that replacements were already en route. For the Germans watching from the ground, the contrast was devastating. Their own aircraft sat idle for want of fuel. Their parachute battalions had long since been retrained as infantry. The Allies could afford to feed the sky, an advantage that turned every drifting canopy into proof that the Reich had lost not just the air, but the means to fight for it. The morning of 26 December 1944 broke through the fog with a sound the men of Bastogne would never forget: the deep, hammering rumble of Sherman tracks approaching from the south. The lead elements of Major General Hugh Gaffey's 4th Armored Division had smashed through the German cordon at Assenois and opened a narrow corridor into the besieged town. After a week of isolation, the 101st Airborne's defenders could finally breathe. Yet their survival owed as much to the sky as to the tanks grinding up the icy road. For 48 hours before the breakthrough, small Allied airborne liaison teams, many of them the same, pathfinders who had jumped or been scattered on, Christmas Eve had reactivated their Eureka beacons. Across the ridges west of the Schnee, Eifel, guided by those faint electronic pulses, squadrons of C-47 Skytrains roared over the battered perimeter at treetop height. Between Christmas Day and the morning of the 26th, they released more than 241 tons of ammunition, rations, and medical supplies to the 101st Airborne Garrison. Crates burst open across the fields and shattered streets, parachutes draping over rooftops and burned-out vehicles. To the weary paratroopers below, it was a miracle of precision. To German observers beyond the line, it looked like an unending invasion. A staff diary from the 26th in the 26th Volksgrenadier Division described a sky filled with floating crates instead of snow, and reported constant enemy landings. In truth, no new divisions had dropped, only a handful of signalmen, pathfinders, and OSS couriers who had managed to link radio contact between Patton's armor and Bastonia's defenders. Those men proved the concept of airborne flexibility that the Allies had spent 2 years refining. Small teams acting as nerve endings for massive ground formations, turning air power into precision relief. When Bastonia's perimeter opened, so too did the doctrine that would define Allied coordination in 1945, from the Rhine crossings to the final push into Germany. For the German soldier crouched among the pines of the Ardennes, the Christmas Eve drops became a ghost story that refused to die. Every gust of wind through the branches could be an American paratrooper creeping forward with a Thompson gun. Each distant flare was feared as a signal for artillery or an airstrike. The imagination filled what the eyes could not see. Rumors spread that saboteurs were poisoning wells, slicing telephone wires, or posing as Wehrmacht officers. In villages from Prüm to Monschau, civilians were warned to watch the skies. Gestapo flyers ordered them to report men falling from the clouds. Sleep became rare, and the line between vigilance and terror blurred completely. Even months later, Allied interrogators leafing through captured. Volksgrenadier diaries found repeated references to Weihnachtsgespenster, the Christmas ghosts, who had supposedly haunted the forests that winter. For the Allies, the same story took on a halo of hope. Newspapers in London and New York splashed headlines about the Santa Claus of the sky, paratroopers dropping gifts of ammunition and medicine to the surrounded defenders of Bastogne. Airmen returning from the 315th Troop Carrier Group's missions were celebrated as symbols of faith and endurance. Within the battered ranks of the 101st Airborne, those parachutes meant life itself. Within the Wehrmacht, they signaled an enemy who seemed able to materialize anywhere, anytime. Psychologically, the divide was total. What filled German hearts with dread filled Allied hearts with triumph. And it revealed a deeper truth about modern war, that perception could wound more deeply than firepower. The Christmas drops, tiny in scale yet vast in consequence, proved that the fear of an invisible enemy could freeze divisions, while the belief in unseen allies could keep a garrison fighting. It was a lesson both armies would carry into the doctrines of airborne warfare that followed the war's end. By the final week of December 1944, the shockwaves from the Christmas Eve airborne reports had seeped into every layer of the German command structure. Convoy dispatchers, already strained by fuel shortages and shattered bridges, now faced a flood of contradictory orders. Reports of parachutists along the Eifel Hills forced entire supply chains to halt, while Feld gendarmerie units inspected every truck and crossroad. Engineers were ordered to sweep bridges for demolition charges allegedly planted by American saboteurs. The result was paralysis. By the morning of December 27th, Sepp Dietrich's vaunted 6th Panzer Army, meant to spearhead the drive to Antwerp, found its forward elements idling for lack of fuel and ammunition. What had been conceived as a blitzkrieg through the Ardennes had slowed to a crawl through rumor and fear. Then the skies cleared. Between December 26 and 27, Allied aircraft returned in force. Fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force and RAF Typhoon squadrons scoured the snowy valleys, strafing and bombing convoys that had been frozen in place by their own precautions. Columns of trucks and half-tracks burned along the N-15, smoke staining the snow black. The very pause created by panic now exposed the Wehrmacht's arteries to annihilation from above. When historians later reconstructed the battle's tempo, they estimated that the fear of airborne infiltration delayed German movement by at least 36 to 48 hours, exactly the time General Patton needed to pivot his Third Army north toward Bastogne. The Christmas Eve chaos did not decide the Ardennes on its own, but it fractured the rhythm of an offensive that depended on speed above all else. From that point forward, even the rumor of paratroopers was enough to alter German plans. In the Ardennes, perception itself had become a weapon, and it marked the moment when the Bulge began to turn. Command in early January 1945 where crews and paratroop officers gathered in frost-bitten hangars to dissect what had gone wrong. The Christmas missions, though legendary for their impact, had also exposed the mechanical and human fragility of airborne warfare in winter. At -15 degrees Celsius, parachute cords stiffened like wire. Canopy silk froze before fully deploying, causing brutal landings that shattered ankles and backs. High-altitude winds scattered drops across 30 kilometers of forest and farmland, turning carefully plotted grids into chaos. Many of the small liaison and OSS teams who leapt into the storm never found their intended zones. Some wandered for days before linking up with Allied lines, while others vanished entirely into the snow. The equipment suffered equally. SCR-300 radios refused to transmit after batteries froze solid. Compasses fogged and jammed, even the luminous paint on wrist dials dimmed in the cold. Pathfinders found their Eureka beacons unreliable under ice buildup, leaving inbound aircraft blind and forcing pilots to guess drop points by dead reckoning. Post-mission analysis estimated a staggering 40%. Loss rate for personnel and supplies combined, proof that courage alone could not overcome weather and physics. Yet, out of those failures came adaptation. The WWII Troop Carrier Command introduced new preheating protocols for aircraft interiors, insulated radio batteries, and reinforced canopy cords with treated nylon fibers. Drop altitudes were lowered for precision. Pathfinder training was expanded to include cold weather survival and rapid beacon repair. The Christmas drop became a case study not in disaster but in evolution, an improvised experiment that taught the airborne forces how to survive their own daring. From its lessons, the airborne divisions would refine their methods for Operation Varsity on the Rhine, where coordination, altitude, and timing finally matched ambition. In the snowbound forests of 1944, they had learned the cost of mastery.